I remember that day as if it were burned into my memory by the hot sun itself. The air was dry, the kind that cracked lips and stole voices, and the wind carried with it the smell of dust and loneliness. That's how most of my life felt back then, dusty, dry, and lonesome. I was a woman living on the edge of the frontier, where men worked themselves half into the ground and women carried burdens just as heavy. My small cabin stood at the end of a wide prairie, where the grass swayed like the ocean and coyotes cried at night. It should have felt like freedom, but for me, it often felt like isolation. I lived alone, though people in town whispered plenty about me. A woman managing her own land wasn't a common sight, and those whispers followed me every time I walked down the wooden sidewalks of town in my boots. I had learned to ignore them, to let my chin lift higher, but deep down, I craved connection. I craved someone who might look past the whispers and see the truth of me. And then came the day the lonely rancher rode up my trail. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the sun at his back. His hat was pulled low, his shirt a faded green from years of wear, and his hands looked like they had worked the land until they had nothing left to give. His horse was weary, his eyes even wearier. And yet, there was something about the way he carried himself, silent, steady, respectful, that caught my breath. He came not out of choice, but out of necessity. He owed rent on a piece of land he'd been working, and I was the one who now held the deed. His pride was written all over him, and I could tell it took everything in him just to knock on my door. I opened it, the hinges creaking. The air between us was heavy. "I came to pay what I owe," he said, his voice deep but soft, carrying the weight of his solitude. He held out a leather pouch, the coins inside clinking against one another. I looked at his hand, at the money, and then back at his eyes. And in that instant, I saw it loneliness, the kind that mirrored my own. I didn't want his money. What I wanted, was something far more rare. So, I shook my head slowly. "I don't need your coin," I whispered. He frowned, confusion shadowing his features. "Then what do you want?" And there it was, the question that hung between us, stretching like the endless prairie sky. What I wanted was simple, though harder for a man like him to give. I wanted his company. His presence. A piece of that strength he carried through his silence. I wanted someone to sit with me when the nights grew too long and the wind too cold. "You've been alone too long," I said softly, almost as if confessing my own truth. "And so have I. Stay a while. Share a meal with me. That's the only payment I'll take." He looked startled, almost taken aback by the simplicity of it. But behind that guarded look of his, I caught a flicker of something, relief, maybe even hope. We sat that evening at my small wooden table, the lamplight flickering between us. The stew was nothing fancy, but he ate it like it was a feast. His rough hands trembled slightly when he lifted the spoon, as though he wasn't used to warmth, not in food, not in company. I asked him about his life, his land, his days working the ranch alone. At first, he spoke little, words drawn out like water from a dry well. But as the night grew darker and the fire crackled lower, his voice found strength. He told me about the storms he'd ridden through, about burying his father with his own two hands, about the silence that pressed on him when the night stretched too long. I listened. God, I listened with everything I had, because I knew that silence too. And then he asked me about myself. No man ever asked me that, not really. Not with real curiosity. But he did. And so I told him of the whispers, of the loneliness, of the way I kept this house standing with grit and prayer. Our words wove together like threads, binding something fragile but real between us. The days that followed turned into weeks. Each time he came by with his leather pouch of rent money, I pushed it back into his hand. "You know my price," I would tease. And each time, he stayed. Sometimes we sat in silence, watching the prairie grass bow in the wind. Sometimes he fixed things around the ranch, his strong hands repairing fences or carrying wood to the porch. And sometimes he would let out the smallest laugh, rough and rusty like it hadn't been used in years. Every time he did, it warmed something inside me I thought had gone cold forever. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire, he finally spoke the words I had longed to hear. "You gave me back more than I came to pay. You gave me back a piece of myself I thought I'd lost." I looked at him then, the lonely rancher who had come to my door with nothing but pride and coin. And I realized what we had built together wasn't a transaction, wasn't about rent or payment at all. It was about two souls finding each other in a land that took more than it ever gave. And in that moment, as the prairie wind brushed through the grass and the last light of the day kissed his weathered face, I knew the truth. I hadn't just given him a place at my table. I had given him a place in my heart. And he had done the same for me.